Welcome to Creative Mornings. March's theme is folklore, a song about the origin of the world, a pot of simmering stew that draws the community to the table, a knot of ribbon in your hand. Folklore binds us to our ancestors, our past to our future. Our Guatemala City chapter chose this month's exploration of folklore, and Sarah Ortega illustrated the theme. We'd like to thank MailChimp, Creative Mornings' official global partner for marketing. 25 big lessons from small businesses. Life has thrown some pretty big curveballs recently. MailChimp spoke to inspiring small business owners from Accra to Colombo to Copenhagen to Bangalore about important business decisions they've made during these turbulent times. Discover what they've learned along the way, including how to build a founding team, deal with competitors, and create an inclusive company. We'd also like to thank the City of Victoria for their ongoing support of the Victoria chapter of Creative Mornings, as well as HCMA. HCMA is an architecture firm that designs buildings, brands, and shared experiences that connect people. And as well as thank you to the Victoria Arts Council, the hosts of Creative Mornings Victoria. This month, we have Crossroads at our main gallery. It's the 2021 Grand National Fiber Art Exhibition featuring 48 fiber artists from across Canada. This exhibition runs until the 22nd of May, so if you are in Victoria, please come down to our gallery at 1800 Store Street to see this this impressive collection of fiber arts. So Creative Mornings is a global network, and we wanted to say that our hearts are going out to our Ukrainian chapters. Our Creative Mornings headquarters has reached out to these chapters and asked them what we can do, and they have supplied a list of resources where you can donate and see how you can help. And you can find a link to this list on the Creative Mornings website homepage. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this week. Coming from the Victoria Storytellers Guild, we have Andrea Brimmel and Jennifer Ferris. Andrea Brimmel is the Vice President of the Victoria Storytellers Guild. She started storytelling in her job at the Greater Victoria Public Library in 1993. The next year, she took a storytelling workshop from Najama Firstman and Pat Carfra, founding members of the Guild. She was hooked. She told stories at the library, in schools, and in the community. When she became a manager at the library in 2008, she no longer told stories to children. She gradually became involved with the Guild and began telling stories for adults. Jennifer Ferris has been an active storyteller for more than 30 years. She has performed in schools, community events, seniors facilities, nature sanctuaries, as well as festivals in Canada and USA. Acutely aware of the power of humor and language, she engages audience of all ages with stories of real life, the folk realm, myth, magic, and transformation. She gives storytelling workshops to adults, children, families, and international ELL students. Participants find that her gentle approach and enthusiasm offers a safe environment to try new ideas. Jennifer.
So I will first do a little bit about the origins of folk tales, and then we'll pass it on to Jennifer. We have probably about 20 minutes talking, and then we'll be open to discussion, questions, and if time, a couple of short little stories. So this is the magic and wisdom of folklore. Just starting off with a little bit of definition. So we're going to be talking about how storytellers employ folklore and folk tales to engage audiences of all ages. Folklore is defined as traditional beliefs, customs, and stories of a community passed through the generations by word of mouth. Folklore includes traditional customs, tales, songs, sayings, dances, and art forms preserved among a people. It includes myths and legends, though where gods are featured, these are often grouped with religion. Now, nursery rhymes is also folklore because each culture or country have their own. Some have been passed from culture to culture, others are unique. And I'm just going to take a moment to share one nursery rhyme with you from a few different countries. This one, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet, eating her curds and whey. There came a big spider who sat down beside her and frightened Miss Muffet away. And an Australian version is, Little Miss Muffet arose from her tuffet to box with the old kangaroo. There came a big wombat to join in the combat, and little Miss Muffet withdrew. Now I'll try my hand at the Jamaican version. Lickle Miss Julie cotch pon our stoolie, and Niam wan right Bombay. Den Breda and Nancy come frightened to pick me, and thief the ripe mango away. So you can see how it changes culture to culture. In recent years, Mother Goose programs they're for young children, and they keep nursery rhymes alive by teaching them orally, because this is the thing, folklore has to be passed along orally. And so these Mother Goose programs have been great for that. Now, folk and fairy tales are what people often think of when they think of folklore. And these too have passed from country to country, culture to culture, or are unique. For example, Africans brought their stories of the spider trickster Anansi, who was referred to in that last nursery rhyme, and the rabbit trickster Brer Rabbit to the United States. Most cultures have trickster animal characters like coyote or raven in the North American indigenous tales. Now, the Cinderella story, which we're all familiar with, there are hundreds of variants that have been identified with names such as Cap o' Rushes, Cinderwench, Aschenputtel, and Cendrillon. So today we're focusing on folk tales and fairy tales because as storytellers, these work well with our art form of storytelling. Storytellers strive to keep oral traditions alive by telling these stories and not reading them. But we usually work from stories that have been written down for the convenience of preserving the story. For example, stories were collected and written down by Charles Perrault in France in 1697 and the Grimm brothers in Germany in 1812. And these are still alive today. To find the roots and meaning of a story, it can be helpful to compare different versions or retellings before telling your story. And each teller will be tempted to put their own spin on a story. And this is how stories change over the ages. But it is not recommended to change a story too much, such as omitting passages that seem too violent, because that can change the intent and the impact of the story. But that being said, some fairy tales have evolved to be made more suitable for young children. And a good example of that is Little Red Riding Hood, which in its original versions is very sexual. And just thinking about a little girl or a girl getting into bed with a strange man or wolf. The intent of the story was to frighten young girls and keep them away from strange men. But anyway, that story has been told for young children, and there's something to be learned for everyone. With that, I'm going to go into a little bit about the power of folk tales and fairy tales. Folk and fairy tales can have a profound impact on the listener. They are important to help people understand the world around them and to grow as individuals. Stories are often centuries old and are the powerful tools of folklore. They deeply resonate with us throughout our lives. Folk and fairy tales are engaging because the stories are imaginative, usually have gripping plots, and have character types that we can relate to and empathize with. Often the characters have problems we can identify with. As they solve their problems, the audience learns something about problem solving. There are usually elements of magic. For example, an old crone who gives magic objects to the hero or heroine to help them on their quest. This illustrates that we don't have to solve our problems alone. As we journey through life, there will be people and changing circumstances with power to assist us. So these kind of tales reach us at different stages of our lives. And I'm going to use some of these stages that Gila Kiyum, a child psychiatrist with the Yale University and Medical School and Department of Psychiatry, suggests. For a young child, listening to folk and fairy tales can be empowering. They identify with the hero who triumphs through many adventures and challenges. Stories can be an outlet for aggression. But as they mature, these stories can help a child gain resilience and mastery over themselves. And for young adults, folktales can help with identity formation, finding out who they are, where they fit in the world, and who they might become. The meanings of folktales change the older we get. We take different messages from the stories as we age. The stories with staying power are the ones rich enough to provide layers of meaning throughout our lives. So there are many types of folk and fairy tales and many different themes. But because of our time constraints today, I'm going to touch on a theme, and Jennifer will be as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the theme of transformation, which is well illustrated in the Beauty and the Beast story. We experience transformation throughout our lives as we grow up, mature, and eventually age. Transformation or change is not always welcome, as in the story of Snow White. The queen could not face getting old. Being the most beautiful woman in the land was so important to her that she would try to kill the young Snow White, who her mirror told her was the fairest in all the land. But we can transform inwardly as we mature and become a different person from whom we were when we were very young. Transformations are happening all around us. For example, even as the seasons change, there are transformations. Now, the story of Beauty and the Beast is based on the early Greek and Roman myth of Cupid and Psyche from the 4th century BC. And is the familiar tale of a young woman who must go and stay at the castle of a hideous beast. This version is from 1757 in France by Madame Le Prince de Beaumont. Beauty does not know that in order for the beast to transform into a prince, that she must stay and come to love him for who he is. When it seems like he is dying, she finally realizes that she loves him. and he transformed into the prince he really is. Another theme in Beauty and the Beast is bravery. How brave would you have to be to agree to go and live with a terrifying and ugly beast? In these stories, the girl is afraid, but she faces her fears. We are constantly facing our own recurring fears throughout our lives. In the Beauty and Beast stories, it is the beast that gets transformed back into a human. The girl's bravery and inner strength of will and character make the magical transformation happen. But it is not only the beast that transforms, it is the heroine herself. By facing her fears, she becomes a queen or an immortal. Another such story is a folktale from Norway, east of the sun and west of the moon. In this story, a woodcutter, his wife, and his 3 daughters are approached by a great white bear. The family was poor, and the bear offered the woodcutter riches in exchange for his youngest daughter. In life, it's wise to be cautious about whom we trust. And it's only by seeing the bear's true form that the girl finally trusts him. And then it's too late. He's gone. But happily, in fairy stories, this can be turned around. It took a lot of courage and bravery, though, for her to pull off the happy ending for herself and her prince. Another type of story that illustrates transformations is The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which is kind of a magical, filled with magical transformations. This is a story of a poor boy who goes to work for a powerful magician. And because he is able to read, he gradually learns how to do the spells of the magician. And then, through a series of magical transformations, he finally manages to outwit the magician and put an end to him, and is able to marry the princess. Stories about transformation give us an imaginative and entertaining way to see change as a moment full of new possibility. Through life's adventures, we grow into mature adults, the people we are meant to be. And that is where I am going to end and turn this over to my partner, Jennifer.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Andrea, for that wonderful introduction. Andrea and I work in the world of storytelling, the storytelling part of folklore. And for the most part, the stories that we were brought up with and that we research come from the Western world, although that Western canon of storytelling includes stories from Africa, from China, from India, from places that we had trade routes with, the silk trade, the spice trade with the great Zimbabwe or Timbuktu. But we are surrounded by folklore, the way that an older woman might wear her hair, the clothes that I wear, the tattoo that my son might choose to put on his chest, the jokes that I enjoy, the food that I cook, the taboos, the rites and rituals. For me, the ritual of girl to young woman, from young woman to adult to motherhood. And of course, the rite of passage that we don't celebrate in the Western world, from ability to have children to that stage in my life when I can have sex without being afraid that I'll get pregnant. And now I'm in the stage of grandmother, and I reach back to the knowledge of my ancestors so that I can do that very important job. I worked as an education assistant for 20 years in an elementary school and high school in Victoria. I worked, because of my job, working with children with disabilities, I worked in all grades. I told stories in all the classrooms where I worked, often stories to curriculum, and I drew from folk tales, fairy tales, myths and legends, and personal narrative, which is also part of folklore. I found even the most unruly classroom proved to be very good audience. Children, as Andrea said, love that business of being someone with no power, who goes out into the world, finds themselves in a dangerous place, a forest, a cave, or in the dungeons of the villain of the piece. But they come out into the sunlight and into safety at the end of the story. Some of the children that I worked with were, the terms change, but they were labeled with conduct disorder or oppositional deviant. They had problems with impulse. They were some of my best listeners. Not everybody's life is filled with rainbows and unicorns. Some of the children, those children and others in the school, came from really difficult homes. It was so important for them to know that they could be in a dark place and yet they could come out into the light and safety. And not because they used their fists, but because like the main character in the folktale or the fairy tale, they used help from an elder or their own wit, their own intelligence. And I will just say something about that old woman who sits at the side of the road and the main character shares food, and the old woman reaches down. She's often sitting by a well or a ditch or a cave, and she reaches down into the other world, the world of the supernatural, and draws out a bit of knowledge that will help our protagonist upon their way. So I certainly think that storytelling is very important, especially when it comes to using your wits. You know, thousands of years ago, we huddled around the fire as the sun went down and it became completely black. I mean, pitch black. And so we huddled together around that fire, afraid of what lay in the darkness, in the forest, on the savannah, dangers that we didn't even have a name for. And so we took comfort in custom, in ritual, in rites of passage, and stories to keep us safe. Folklore is of the past, but it also operates in the present. And I have to say that I'm one of those people that loves a scary story. You know, as I said, lives are not always filled with unicorns and rainbows. Stories are not always filled with pretty fairies and handsome men. In some stories, there are dead babies. There's racism. There's shaming. And there are monsters. And I have to say, I'm one of those people that goes on the internet. Now, I'm going to contradict Andrea here, although she and I passionately support the oral storytelling because of the richness and the closeness of connection between audience and teller. I think the internet is an absolute treasure trove of folklore. Well, of course, you can find the text of an old story, but there are memes and deets, and there are podcasts. Now, I love folklore podcasts. One of my favorites is Lore, L-O-R. Lore is the gender part of that word, folklore. Well, I like to listen to lore and listen to really bloodthirsty stories. I go out into my garden with my phone and my earplugs, and I listen to stories, just true stories where there has been a slim, naked needle of fact that is clothed with story. One of them that I like, I'm going to tell you about, it was on a series of crimes in early Victorian and late Victorian London. In 1790, stories arose of a man pursuing women and pricking them with pins, piercing women through their clothing with a sharp pin. He became the London monster, but was never caught. Now, with folk tales, well, folklore in general, it only survives if it's useful to the people. We know that folk tales are a transmission of knowledge, the laws of what we say, what we do, and what we make. But a folk tale or a piece of folklore, if it's not useful anymore to a generation, it will slip away. And so the story of the London monster slipped away, but was brought back in 1803 when there was another series of attacks. This time, the women were attacked by a man all in white. He had sharp claws on his hands, and he tore at their clothing and sometimes at their skin if he could reach through the clothing. He was, in fact, identified as a man called Thomas Manville. He was, all the women said, he was a man dressed completely in white. When Thomas was found, it was found out that he was a plasterer, so of course his clothing were covered in white. All was quiet for a while until 1837, when a young woman, Polly Mann, was returning from an evening at the Green Man Inn. Of course, the Green Man is a huge character in Breston mythology and folktale. On her way home, she was set upon by someone. He tore at her clothing, even scratched the skin of her stomach. She survived, managed to get away, and described her attacker as a tall, thin man, all dressed in white, like a complete single bodysuit. And as he ran away, she noticed that he leapt over high walls. And so the stories began of young women being attacked by this man, all in white, who could jump over high walls and scale buildings. He became known as Spring Heel Jack. The story went viral. The Penny Dreadfuls, those broadsheets of the day, had stories about him. The Punch and Judy, this was a puppet show for children, often seen at the seaside, Punch and Judy. They renamed one of their characters, who used to be the devil, but was now called Jack. He was never, Spring Heel Jack was never identified or found. And then things went quiet again until the late 1870s, when we hear the story of Jack the Ripper. Well, in 2008, Eric Knudsen, who's also known as Victor Surge, created a supernatural creature, tall, thin, long arms, usually seen completely white, who was able, some say, to jump over high fences. This is an entirely internet folk phenomenon who stalks people, although particularly children, that harps back to the monsters of Victorian London. I'm going to end my presentation here because I'm hoping that there'll be lots of discussion and questions. And Andrea and I have done quite a bit of research to find out what we know and what we thought we knew. And we've learned a lot by preparing ourselves for this presentation. So now I'm going to hand it back to Leah, our moderator, for the rest of the presentation of the morning.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Andrea. That was fantastic. So we're going to open it up to a Q&A now. And I invite you to write your questions into the chat and I can read them out. Or if you're comfortable, you can unmute yourself and ask away.
And if you don't have any questions, I have some for you that might spark some discussion.
That's very tempting, Andrea, because I'm still trying to formulate my question. It has something to do with the perilous times that we find ourselves in and the role folklore and storytelling can play in not only sort of educating and maybe even warning people, but also bringing people together. And I really loved how both you and Jennifer kind of approached it from two different sides of that coin. So again, I'm still trying to formulate a question, but maybe that's enough for the two of you to go on something in this sort of current climate that we're in.
Right. Well, I'll just leap out here. Of course, we think about Ukraine, but there are many other problems in the world. And I'm sure that there'll be questions and observations and opinions about the role of women in folktale and folklore. I'm going to leave that aside for a moment and just focus on abortion rights in the States. We see now that those rights are being chipped away at. And although there are many stories in folklore, folk and fairy tale, myths and legends, where women are seen as powerless, used to, not so long ago, we would have said, well, we should put those stories aside and only tell the many stories where women are active, you know, the hero. But perhaps it would serve us to look back at some of those stories where women are subjugated, because it's so easy to chip away at freedoms and think that this is the first time, and it's not. And if we look back at the wisdom of folk and fairy tale, then we might understand the dangers that we are facing in the diminution of the rights of women. But I'm going to hand it over to Andrea because she may also have something to say on this subject.
I just think that, just as I was describing, just to sort of stick with the theme of Beauty and the Beast, you know, even though like in those days, certainly women did not have choices. If they were told they were going to marry someone, they had to marry someone. But, you know, in those stories of East of the Sun, West of the Moon, and Beauty and the Beast, you know, those women used what they had. They used resources, they used inner resources to actually overcome their problems. And, you know, even though they may not have been able to change at that time, how they were given to men, you know, it does, just from hearing those stories and living those stories, that women have found out that by continuing to, you know, fight to overcome and gain their own freedoms, it does come to pass. It may take a long time, and those stories can certainly give us comfort in difficult times, because we can only stand, for example, to listen to the news of Ukraine for so long, and then we need something to build our resources up. And I really find that reading these old stories and telling them and seeing the reactions of people, I really believe they do give us inner resources. And, you know, then we might turn away and we might later say to ourselves, well, maybe I can do something for the Ukraine. Maybe I can host a Ukrainian family, help them to come to freedom, or something like that.
If I might just add to what Andrea has said with regard to Ukraine, I just know what I read in the newspapers and heard on the radio, but I know that many of the cultural, the museums have been bombed. You know, even the word cultural genocide has come up as far as Ukraine is concerned, because, of course, if you want to destroy a people, you destroy their culture, just as when settlers came to Canada, they tried to destroy the culture that was here, thinking that they would then destroy the people. So it is, I think, I have a book of Ukrainian stories upstairs, which I'm going to have a look at. I won't necessarily tell those stories, but I will certainly gain something from those stories to keep those stories alive.
I see a question here in the chat from Lou. Lou says, can anyone recommend more resources for Western folklore, podcasts or books or anything of the sort?
Well, maybe I'll start this one. I agree with Jennifer. There is a lot to be found on the internet. It's incredible. But I just want, since I'm a librarian at the public library, the Greater Victoria Public Library, I just want to put in a plug for 398.2, which is where you can find, that's the number in the Dewey Decimal System, where you can find fairy tales, folk tales. And in the children's section, it is mostly fairy tales and folk tales, but in the adult section of 398.2, that's where you will find resources to read about the sources of folk tales and fairy tales. I have a short sort of bibliography, but I mean, I had an Oxford Companion to Fairy Tales that I had got a year or so ago, but never cracked it open until this time, which was really great because it did give me, you know, some facts and some deeper information about folk and fairy tales.
Yeah. Well, Joseph Jacobs is a great collector of folk and fairy tales, and Jack Zipes, Z-I-P-E-S, is also.
Yes, he's the editor of this Oxford Companion to Fairy Tales.
Okay.
So
yeah. So yeah, I would say with Andrea is to go to that part of the library and just immerse yourself in those stories, and that's where you get old and new versions, perhaps versions of stories that are more friendly to women, or and the folk and fairy tales that are collected that really were told to me when I was a child, is they were collected by men, and so I think that they may have overlooked the agency of women in folk tales, although certainly Andrea has a list of folk tales where women are the most important characters, both either going out, like Kate Crackernuts, going out and being incredibly brave, or Molly Whuppie, or like The Black Horse, which is an Irish tale, where the woman, she is constrained by the dangers of the road and several other things, overbearing brother. She sends the guy, the hero, the young man, she sends him out 3 times into incredibly dangerous situations so that she can be freed from marriage with the man that she doesn't want. So women sometimes are the active element in a story, or they may be sort of the brain behind the action.
Yes, I've certainly always been fascinated with stories about strong women. And yeah, Jennifer has named a couple. I'll throw out a couple of other ones. The Baba Yaga and Vasilisa the Brave, which is a Russian story. Clever Monka and the Judge, told throughout Europe. Now, Clever Monka starts out as a peasant girl, and but she's so clever that she catches the attention of, well, in this version, the judge in the village, and she can always come up with the best answer to a problem or to a riddle, and she eventually, he eventually falls in love with her and they get married, and there is some trouble after that because she's supposed to promise not to help out with any of his cases in the village where he has to judge, but she can't help it because her husband misses the obvious, but eventually it all works out.
Yeah.
And
there's a story from Kazakhstan which has the same theme, except that it's the Shah and the woman is a woodcutter, but it's the same idea. It's using knowledge, that knowledge being somewhat curtailed by the person in power, but the woman prevails anyway and shares her knowledge.
Yeah. So, do we have any more questions yet, Leah? Or because I was going to pose a question to our little group here.
There aren't any in the chat. Does anyone in the group though feel comfortable? You can unmute yourself and ask a question. Otherwise, maybe we'll let Andrea ask us something.
Yeah, I just was curious as to what folk or fairy tale influenced you as a child or adult. Well, and if you can't think of a folk or fairy tale, how does the power of storytelling affect your life in general? Books that you've read or movies you have watched.
I can answer your first question for myself. I think my I first came to know a lot of these folk tales and fairy tales through Disney movies. Growing up in the early 90s, that was my big introduction, and I was absolutely enamored with all of the Disney movies that were reiterating these folk tales. But going back to like printed matter to books, I really loved the story of Stone Soup. If that's, I see you're nodding. That's great. But I'm not sure if I really remember it now. It's somebody. It's kind of like a trickster where he invites everyone in the community to add something to his stone soup, and then because all he had was a rock, and by the end he has this full meal.
Yeah, yeah, it's a wonderful story, and many versions too. I think the original I know is French, but I know a wonderful Central American version of that story.
Yes, a kind of a situation where, you know, at times there were famines or lack of food in villages or areas. And one story I know is a soldier returning from war, and he goes door to door asking for food, but everyone says they don't have anything to share. And that's when he and his companion decide to set up in the market square, and they ask for a pot. You know, they ask for, and then they start out with the stone, yes, and then they ask for a pot, and they put the stone in the pot and said, we're going to make stone soup. And then they ask for each villager to bring what they have: an onion, a carrot, you know, a turnip, some rice, some noodles, you know, a chicken leg, things like that, until and water, of course, until they have a big pot of soup, which is wonderful and shows how, you know, if you share, if you have little, if you share, you have more, and also create a community at the same time.
I was asked to tell Stone Soup at a fundraiser for a family whose son had a tumor on the brain, and he would have to go to Vancouver to be treated, and his family had no, I mean, his treatment was paid for, but in order for the family to go over and stay in McDonald House to support him, they needed extra money, and they had no money. So my hairdresser said, who's a very inventive, very clever woman, said, I'm going to have a fundraiser, and we're going to have a fashion show and a makeup show, and you're going to tell a story, and we're going to raise money. Oh, okay, you know, count me in. So I said, oh, okay, time and place. So I was to be at the venue at 7 o'clock, and the venue was the Red Lion Inn on Douglas Street, which, as far as I knew, was an exotic dancing place. But apparently the Red Lion Inn had put aside 2 hours for this fundraiser, and there would be no exotic dancing. So I arrived, and Hannah, my hairdresser, was busy getting people dressed, doing their hair. I mean, it was wonderful because she just invited lovely young women of all shapes and sizes, you know, of all, I mean, just normal bodies to wear the clothing provided by a shop downtown. And she said, we're going to have the fashion show, and you're going to tell the story, and then there would be other things going on, some fundraising things going on afterwards. So she said, you just go into the bar, because that's where it was. You just go in, here's a ticket for a glass of wine, and just wait, you know, until it's your turn. So I go into the bar. I didn't know what to expect, but there are huge disco balls going around and Greek pillars and a large bar, and there was music. I think it was you know, it wasn't real musicians, it was recorded music. The people on the floor were young people that, you know, were not part of my life. But anyway, so I thought, okay, I'm going to sit down. I had to introduce myself to the Master of Ceremonies, who was a man about my age, but he had dyed blonde hair, and he was wearing a very tight shirt. And I said, I'm Jennifer, and I'm going to tell a story. His face curdled with disgust. He said, you go sit down over there and wait your turn. So I thought I could either run away now, or I could wait and tell my story. So I thought, no, I'm going to drink my wine, I'm going to tell my story, and then I'm going to leave. There was an act before me. It was a hip hop band of young men from Nanaimo. So they performed, and to cheers and claps. And then now somebody called Jennifer Ferris is going to tell us a story, says the Master of Ceremonies. So I go up on the stage, and I start my story of stone soup, and oh, it's going quite well. People are responding. I have a couple of questions, what vegetables would they put in? People responded when participated. Everything went well. I told my story. I went off the stage. I thought, oh, okay, now I'm going home. So to get out, I had to walk through two bouncers, two huge men. So I squeezed my way between the two huge men, and outside here were the hip hop young men out there for a smoke break. And I thought, oh, now I have to walk through the hip hop group to get to my car. So excuse me. And one of the men was the man who did all the speaking in this group, came up to me, and I thought, oh God, what's he going to say to me? He said, oh, you told stone soup. It was my favorite story when I was a child. And immediate connection, like, well, folklore is connecting. I think folk stories, and they can be personal narrative as well as traditional stories from long ago. So rich, and so as we're being pulled apart, we need story to bring us together.
That's beautiful. And you're such a good storyteller. Thank you so much.
Andrea's pretty good too.
So we do have some people have put their favorite stories into the chat here. From Lee Portius, we can't forget the 1001 Nights. And then Irene said, I remember being read a lot of classic folktales, such as The Three Billy Goats Gruff. And Monica mentions Rumpelstiltskin, where the monster that will steal the firstborn child chants, today I bake, tomorrow I brew, showing how an overemphasis on our making ourselves busy can steal away the true treasures of life.
Oh, that's a wonderful reflection.
And then Vienna mentioned too, The Emperor's New Clothes, and then much later, Ovid's Metamorphosis. I don't know if you want to speak to any of those or to them maybe in general, or
Andrea?
Well, I guess starting at the top, the 1001 Nights that Lee mentioned, that's the story. That's true storytelling. A young woman, Scheherazade, a concubine, she manages to keep the king enthralled with storytelling for 1001 nights in order to save her life. That's a pretty amazing story. And I love to mention the other ones, Rumpelstiltskin. That is a great sort of takeaway from that story. That's all about names, the importance of someone's name. And Three Billy Goats Gruff, that is one of the stories of animal stories where we can learn from those stories as well, and also illustrates something that comes up in stories often, threes, numbers in stories, 3 or 7 are very popular, but the Three Billy Goats Gruff, I think, is a great one for children and does show that, you can stand up to a bully. And just The Emperor's New Clothes is, it is definitely a fairy tale, but it does have an actual right author, Hans Christian Andersen. So, and that's such a good story, The Emperor's New Clothes, where he ends up going naked down the street because he, fell for these tricksters, and he was really afraid to stand up to actually speak the truth. So anyway, yes, and Ovid's Metamorphosis, I can't say too much about that, though I did come across it in my readings and my brain struggling to remember what.
Kagan. Thank you. Kagan, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to, just because I know we're about 5 minutes out from the hour now, and it's been such a rich discussion, but I also wanted to make sure that we leave room to talk about the Storytellers Guild and what you do as a group and how you serve your community here in Victoria in a creative way.
Andrea.
So the platform continues to be yours to just maybe bring it back to the work you do as storytellers.
Okay, go ahead, Andrea.
No, I guess I can start off. Well, we are, one of our main goals is to keep storytelling alive, and we don't seem to have any trouble doing that because we have a lot of members, about 100, I think, and we meet monthly here in Victoria on Fern Street. We were not able to meet in person, of course, for a couple of years, and so we moved to Zoom, and that is still continuing now in a hybrid way. So those of you who live in Victoria or afar could still attend. And I think Leah was going to put our website in the chat. Thank you, Leah. And we meet on the third Monday of the month. And if you go to our website, you can register there if you wanted to join the Zoom meeting. So we just had a meeting on March 21st, and our next one will be April 18th. And we've generated themes, though we don't have to stick to the themes. The theme for April is All That Glitters. And the session runs for an hour and a half to 2 hours. And as I say, you can join by Zoom. And we do, you can give us a small donation of $5 if you wish, or you can become a member for $25, and that's for the whole year. We don't officially have meetings in July and August, though with COVID, we did start doing some storytelling sessions in our gardens in the summer. And, we feature, people usually volunteer to tell stories, and that's how we fill up our meeting time. Sometimes we have special storytellers come in and do part of a program or a full program for us. The last couple of years, those have been on Zoom, though we do have in the past done them at our Fern Street location, which belongs to the Friends, the Quaker Friends.
If you're a member, we also have what we call Stories in Between, which is an opportunity for tellers. We have been doing it on Zoom, but we used to do it in person, where you meet and just bring a story that you're working on or story idea to discuss and get some feedback. So we do try to support our members in that way. And we do outreach, not too much the last couple of years, but we do get invitations to tell in, for community groups just like this one.
Yeah, and upcoming, just because we have a couple of minutes left, we here on Vancouver Island, our national storytelling group, Stories of Canada, Contour du Canada, is going to have their annual conference in Parksville towards the end of May. Mm-hmm. So you can attend as much or little as you want, including some storytelling sessions in the evening, or concerts, I guess they're called. So the Storytellers of Canada, and I don't know if you can find the link for that. The Storytellers of Canada, it's called SCCC, which you might be able to just pull that up quickly on the internet. So we're looking forward to that.
And Leah's mentioned that we have a library as well. We call the Root Cellar, of books that have been collected over the years. And that's available to members.
Yeah, so that's a resource too. Mm-hmm. And Lee Porteous, who is attending today, she is actually our president of the Guild.
Nice. That's great. And in terms of the library, do you accept donations too? Or is that maybe a little bit cumbersome?
Donate to the library. Well, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. Noted. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer and Andrea. That was I just love the way that you were able to inform us of how fairy tales have been around forever, as we know, and folklore, but that it evolved or changed over time to reflect the mores of society, but also the sort of ways that we wanted to uphold and uplift different parts of our cultures. So that is really something to keep in mind. And I'm really excited to think now about, other stories that we'll come across and think, oh, how far back does this go if we start pulling these threads? So, yeah.
Yes,
Thanks for inviting us.
It's amazing how many movies, are often based on an old story.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk about the subject that we love. Appreciate all the thank yous in the chat.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
And just before we part ways, I just want to mention our next Creative Morning session in April is April 29th. And the theme is Kismet. And we're going to have Victoria-based poet Mary Metaphor Specht will be joining us to talk on this kind of ephemeral theme of Kismet. So please keep your eye out for that event, which will be live next week to register. And thank you again, Jennifer and Andrea.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
You're welcome.
It's
Yeah,
lovely.
it's great to have you.
Okay, have a good weekend. I'm going to end the Zoom here. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.